My name is Doug Bicklin. I'm Dean of the School of Education. I want to welcome you to this centennial lecture. Kris Gutierrez earned her PhD in English and Education at the University of Colorado. She is a professor in the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. She is also director of the Center for the Study of Urban Literacies at UCLA. Her research interests include the relationship of literacy, culture, and human development, cognitive and social consequences of school literacy and biliteracy practices, the school organization of learning, equity-oriented educational and language policy, and everyday practices of middle-class working families. Dr. Gutierrez has received numerous awards. She is a fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences. She's recipient in 2004 of the Sylvia Scribner Award from Division C of the AERA, that's the American Education Research Association. She won the Harriet and Charles Luckman UCLA Distinguished Teaching Award, and she was awarded a Spencer Foundation mentorship grant and was chosen as Outstanding Latina for the Outstanding Latino, so she beat out the men, Faculty Award of the American Association of Higher Education. And now today she is recognized as a centennial speaker of Syracuse University's School of Education. This is the part I like especially. She has secured several millions of dollars of support for her research. She has been a principal investigator or participant in 55 funded projects. I don't want to give the impression that money is important in the academic world, but I suspect her dean thinks she's pretty great. Dr. Gutierrez's publication titles are provocative in just the ways I think you'll appreciate. Listen to a few of them. White Innocence, a framework and methodology for rethinking educational discourse. Sounding American, the consequences of new reforms on English language learners. And Script, Counterscript, and the Underlife in the Classroom, James Brown versus Board of Education. Today, in her Syracuse University School of Education Centennial Lecture, Dr. Gutierrez is speaking on looking for educational equity, immigrants, migrants, and the new Latino diaspora. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Gutierrez.
Good afternoon, and thank you. Can you hear me? No? Yes? It's not really working. They're fixing. They're kind of, well, I'll use my teacher voice. The grant, by the way, that I loved most and that my students loved most was the Spencer Foundation mentorship grant, because you literally open your mail one day and they don't tell you, and you get a check for $50,000. But that check has to be used exclusively for the use of mentoring your students. So we did tons of things, and every time we would do it, at the end, all my students would say in unison, "Thank you, Poppy Spencer," because Spencer was very good to me. I would like to begin by thanking in particular Dean Bicklin and Sari Bicklin for inviting me to be part of this prestigious lecture series. And to Sandy Tinto, who has put up with so many of the arrangement details that I wouldn't be here otherwise. And so I'm very grateful to them, not only for the invitation, but for accommodating some of the needs that I have. It's really an honor and pleasure to be part of this lecture series. And I have to just tell you as an aside, coming from California and being raised from Arizona, coming to Syracuse is an interesting experience. And so I came wearing my Finland clothes because I had been to Finland last year. And so when I arrived waddling into the hotel room, they knew immediately who I was. They were expecting me from California. So it's not really that bad yet, but I guess I am in store for some interesting things tonight, I hear. So in typical fashion, I really take these seriously, so I have prepared a paper that draws on a larger body of work that I'm doing for a book. And it does elaborate a concept that was first introduced in the James Brown versus Board of Education, the third space, but I won't get to all of it. But I will make the paper, the larger paper, available to you if you're so interested. The goal of my talk today is to argue for a paradigm shift in what counts as schooling for youth in the United States. As Ellen Luke has argued, this work calls for a new educational vision organized around robust, equity-oriented criteria for creating a more just and democratic educational system in an increasingly complex, transnational, and hybrid world. Such a vision entails redesigning what counts as teaching and learning to poor and immigrant youth, whose education has been defined by marketplace reforms, that is, reforms that bring the business principles of efficiency, accountability, quality, and choice to establish the educational agenda. Such reforms employ what my graduate student Kristen Crosland has named the sameness as fairness principle, making it easier to roll back the small gains in educational equity and to implement colorblind practices such as English only, one-size-fits-all curricula, and high-stakes assessment policies and practices. We see the politics of race and class at work in the ideologies underlying these educational policies and practices, including the ways language and literacy and measures of ability function as educational proxies that sustain privilege for students from dominant groups through the persistence of colorblind, merit-based interventions. For example, consider that students who experience schooling in increasingly deplorable and inequitable learning environments are held to the same measure of accountability as their more privileged counterparts. Undergirded by what I think is a fictitious meritocracy in which significant inequality across institutions and their practices is accepted as a function of hard work, ability, competence, and motivation. The discourse around school reform increasingly essentializes what counts as education and learning, as well as the learner and her community's practices. As I have written elsewhere, contemporary theorizations of non-dominant communities often work hand in glove with narrow and static notions of non-dominant and poor communities to construct and employ deficit, classist, and racist explanations of the underachievement of non-dominant students, especially in core subject areas like literacy, mathematics, and science. Now, you might notice that I'm using the term non-dominant. And my students and I said that we needed a term that more accurately referred to the lived circumstance of people, and minority doesn't fit, and all the other labels are deficit. What really is at issue is the issue of power. And so we think that non-dominant gets closer to accounting for that relationship. And so you'll hear me use dominant and non-dominant students. Consistent with these views, deficit ideologies and reductive notions of culture and cultural communities are pervasive in our nation's discourse and are deeply embedded in notions of success, excellence, and merit. And I won't have time today, but I've been doing a lot of work about the role of cultural learning. And Barbara Rogoff and I did an article a couple of years ago in Ed Researcher, really taking on reductive notions of culture and the learning styles literature, including cultural learning styles literature, that really essentialize and normalize these very narrow notions of culture. And if I had time, I'd elaborate, but my colleague Fred Erickson said, "Oh, I get it, Kris. The mantra should be 100% of Mexicans don't hit piñatas 100% of the time. Or African-American students don't listen to hip-hop 100% of the time." The point is to not conflate culture with race and ethnicity, and to distinguish between culture and cultural practices. But that's a whole nother talk. But really, that's critical. Those notions are critical as they underlie so much of the policy we have today. The devaluing of the social, the cultural, symbolic, and intellectual capital of non-dominant communities serves to minimize any threat to dominant communities and institutions, and thus marginalizes and problematizes any form of difference. These inequities are often magnified in regions of the country that are experiencing new demographic shifts and where anti-immigrant sentiments and educational reform policies work together to normalize the underachievement of non-dominant students, especially immigrant students, and their dramatically inequitable learning conditions. Guided by the sameness is fairness principle and its colorblind practices, for example, the new federalized literacy program promotes a normative view of children living in poverty, their learning needs, as well as their community's language practices. Under these initiatives, children from non-dominant communities, including English learners, are still most likely to receive a one-size-fits-all diet of language and literacy instruction, even though they have a range of learning strengths and needs and diverse language practices. Here, language becomes a proxy for race and ethnicity and serves as a tool for organizing schooling around this sameness as fairness principle that helps to ensure new forms of segregation and inequity. Further, these English-only and one-size-fits-all programs not only expose students to the most restrictive literacy diet and limit the use of their full linguistic toolkit in the service of learning, they also attempt to erase differences that matter. This enduring inequity is not solely an educational problem. I would argue it is at its core a moral issue. But rather than taking a pessimistic approach to counter the current conditions of a failing educational system, today I present a case that I hope illustrates the transformative potential of a humanist and equity-oriented research agenda and project, as well as what I hope is methodological rigor in studying non-dominant communities. I use this case as an example to illustrate how to re-mediate the consequences of the appalling schooling poor students currently receive. Let me make the distinction for you between remediation, the word as we know it, and re-mediation. As Griffin and Cole have argued, re-mediation means to reorganize using new tools and forms of mediation in new ways. And we cannot, we need to move away from this other notion of remediation, which gets at the most narrow, the repetitive, the painful, right? The disembodied. Okay, so I'll use that term. So think of, when I say remediation, I'm referring to the re-mediation. I draw on empirical work from a program I developed 10 years ago that brings high school students from migrant farm worker backgrounds to UCLA for a 4-week intensive program with a rich curriculum, dense with learning activity, organized around social cultural views of learning and development, a related theoretical concept of the third space that I might get to later, and a situated and historicized social critical literacy. This is a remarkable program, if I do say so myself, that has unusual results academically and in terms of opening up the educational pipeline. But the aspect that I will focus on here, what interests me most, is the design of a particular social environment of development in which students begin to reconceive of who they are and what they might be able to accomplish academically and beyond. Historicity is a key concept in this program and across my work, as it is essential to re-mediating the effects of social and educational injustices. As Stephen Biko once said, colonialism is not satisfied merely with holding a people in its grip and emptying the native's brain of all form of content. By a kind of perverted logic, it turns to the past of the oppressed peoples and distorts, disfigures, and destroys them. I will call your attention to a rich interactional matrix constituted by a range of language and embodied practices, including particular grammatical practices that mediate the achievement of a coordinated action around a shared vision of a more just world now and in the future. In doing so, I hope to push, however slightly, on the ways the learning sciences accounts for learning and development for non-dominant youth, and to suggest new methods for documenting and promoting their learning. I begin my remarks in a slightly unorthodox way with the voice of a wise 16-year-old migrant student, Ave, who agreed to let me weave her story throughout this talk, as it best exemplifies, in ways that I cannot begin to capture, the complexity of the ways poverty, discrimination, exploitation, anti-immigrant sentiment, language ideologies, and educational and social policies gone awry complicate current understandings about the teaching and learning of non-dominant students. I draw from her autobiography, written as part of a process of developing a social critical literacy for social action for rising high school seniors participating in this 4-week summer academic residential program at UCLA that I mentioned earlier. Here, her autobiography is an ecologically valid developmental task developed in and about the cognitive and social realities and practices of the participants, both young and old, in the program. We will learn from Ave how she wrote and negotiated her way through the paradoxes of immigration, migration, schooling, and living in the U.S. She begins and entitles her autobiography Silent Life, and begins by, maybe I'll break out in song now. She begins by recalling her detailed life as a young child in Oaxaca, Mexico, and then writes, at 16, she, my mother, got married to someone she didn't know because my grandmother, Virginia, thought that being 16 was too old. A year later, in 1987, I was born in the minuscule town of San Martin, Oaxaca. According to my mother, I was dead, but many say I was half dead. So what did they do? They wrapped me up in a blanket and tossed me up until I awoke. I lived in that town for 4 years, and I can recall waking up to a tree branch filled with spider webs and the smell of tortillas, which we ate with either salt or bugs. I also remember taking cold showers in a gigantic room filled with frogs, as well as the day my parents took me to see the dead body of my 90-year-old grandfather. My mom said doctors and nurses had visited her to taste her food. My father, on the other hand, was a devoted carpenter who at times was randomly chosen to be the mayor of the 800-people town. Then my grandmother heard of El Norte, and we left, and she left. We soon followed. I arrived to California in the trunk of a car. If ever I understood the definition of confusion, it was then. I had no idea where I was and how I got there, but I was finally there, the new world. It was filled with cars, TVs, and above all, poverty. My family lived in a garage after being thrown out of my aunt's house because she felt our family was consuming her children's food. Interestingly enough, we were all extremely thin, and most of her children were overweight. Ave's story of movement across borders, across both new and familiar practices, presents an interesting and unresolved dilemma in education, and in the learning sciences in particular. How do we account for the learning and development embodied by and through movement, the border and boundary crossing of students like Ave? What new capacities are developed? To what extent do these capacities travel across settings? And what new educational arrangements provoke and support new capacities that extend what Barbara Rogoff and I call students' repertoires of practice? This issue of what it means to learn in familiar, new, and overlapping context, in rapidly shifting practices and communities, to understand how the social organization of these environments facilitates or interferes with cognitive work, and how people are made smart by the use of artifacts and participation in particular social group and settings, are central to the work that I would like to share with you today. People live their lives and learn across multiple settings, and this holds true across the big span of their lives, but also across and within institutions and communities they inhabit, even classrooms. I take an approach that urges me to consider the significant overlap across these boundaries as people, tools, and practices travel through different, hybrid, and even contradictory contexts and activities. It is from this perspective that we begin to understand what's cultural about learning and development that occurs as people, ideas, and practices of different communities meet, collide, and merge. Many of us interested in the social and cultural dimensions of education and learning take an approach that resists the binaries of home and school, of formal and non-formal learning, and instead focus on what takes hold as children and youth move in and across the various settings and contexts of their everyday lives. An approach that allows for the identification of both possibility and constraint within and across contexts. In designing and studying learning environments, we have rejected traditional mismatched theories of home and school discontinuities, which are really prevalent in educational literature. Such frameworks reinscribe deficit portraits of home that compel us to fix communities and their participants so that they match normative views and practices without regard to the students' existing repertoires of practice or the additional set of challenges poor immigrant youth experience. I would argue that a more productive framework and method traces students' movement across their daily routines to understand what tools and resources are taken up or available across systems of meaning in everyday life. Paraphrasing Brian Street, I would ask, what additional set of challenges do non-dominant students address as they move across home, school, and other community settings and interact with teachers, peers, and other adults who bring sedimented features of their life's activities and their experiences to bear on their ways of interacting and participating with students. Within this view, I take an approach that suggests that poor children, especially those from non-dominant groups, have both similar and distinct developmental challenges when compared to their peers. Allow me to return briefly to Ava's story to help illustrate this point. She writes, "When my mom figured out how to send me to school, she did, and thus began my silence. I grew up believing I was invisible, and I learned that my vocation was that of an outside observer. Everything I accomplished in school was ignored. In school, kids spoke in English about me because they thought I didn't understand, but I did. They used English to insult everything about me, and I learned to look down on Mexicans. Since I was small and felt so insignificant, I had no friends, and people succeeded in making me feel invisible. I learned to simply observe everything and everyone. But even that bothered people. I was never taught to fight, so instead I did what I did best, stay quiet and take it all in. The silence somehow sent them the message that I was dumb and stupid. People of my own race would call me Oaxaquita with so much disgust that although I didn't know the word, I could understand their meaning. They said it to cause me pain and shame. Sadly, it did." The vulnerability of migrant farm workers like Ave and her community is significant. For example, if we hold poverty constant, we find that migrant children in California, who are also English learners, are most vulnerable in terms of their health, well-being, employment, and educational opportunities. Consider that the average life expectancy of a migrant farm worker residing in the United States is 49 years of age. The average life expectancy in the United States, on the contrary, is 76.2 years. Migrant farm worker children, then, are disproportionately at risk along a number of important dimensions, and their developmental trajectories must also be understood in relation to these risk factors, including the significant risks created by racism, mobility, border crossing, toxic environmental workplaces and communities, inferior schools, and educational and social policies that exacerbate these conditions. In my work, I've tried to tease out some of these relationships and to try to figure out what meaning this movement across and within tasks, events, and interactions has for learning and development, as well as how to make this more evident to educators. Implicit here is a method that encourages us to examine a minimum of two interacting contexts or activity systems to produce more complicated understandings of how the social organization of people's everyday practices supports and constrains people's cognitive and social development. One of the things I would like to do here is to juxtapose Abed's experience with an experience in an artifact-rich environment to discuss a particular set of processes that produce a relationship between social and individual functioning in what my colleagues and I have termed the third space. as a window to understand why certain contexts of learning become particularly meaningful to their participants over time. To provide some context, allow me to briefly describe the UCLA Migrant Student Leadership Institute. The program engages students daily from 6 a.m. to midnight in a range of academic activities, including reading and writing, embedded in the study of social theory and science. And this is a very different science taught by Latino medical students who, with our help, develop a deeply meaningful science curriculum around the health issues of the migrant community. We use tutorials, writing conferences, Teatro del Oprimido, or Theater of the Oppressed, and college preparatory workshops, but they're all offered in relation to an historicized view of the student's own social cultural situation. The activity system of the migrant program has a specific internal logic organized around expanding the student's social, historical, and educational ecology by collectively imagining a new educational and social political future through the process we call social dreaming. That is, a shared vision of a more just world now and in the future. Here, social dreaming, a concept rooted in Paulo Freire and elaborated by my graduate student Manuel Espinosa, serves as a central conceptual metaphor elaborated through the course of the program in the everyday and classroom language, the embodied concepts of teatro, the texts, and classroom instruction. In this way, the object of the Institute, and what I'm arguing is what should be the organizing principle of the way we reframe education. The object of the Institute is the social historical reconstruction of what it means to be a migrant student, and that involves the process of becoming historical actors who invoke the past in order to remediate it so that it becomes a resource for current and future action. Of relevance in this program, we take an ecological approach to learning, transforming space, place, text, language, and other tools to serve new ends towards the development of critical social thought. And remember, these are high school students who've never been assigned a full text to read, an essay to write. As an example, the grassy areas that normally serve as the pathways for students moving from class to class is transformed into public theater, where migrant parents and the residential staff, facilitated by instructors, lead the students in a series of activities that constitutes Theater of the Oppressed. Thus, the reframing of learning as being limited to the classroom is countered in every space of interaction. Both the reinvented classroom and the outdoor space of UCLA are transformed into a space of productive learning activity, all offered in relation to an historicized view of the student's own social cultural situation as migrants, immigrants, and youth. Of significance, the work of the migrant program does not focus on the students' linguistic deficiencies, but rather on the social historical influence on their language and literacy practices, as well as on their social, economic, and educational realities, things mediated by the social, both proximately and concretely. The curriculum and its pedagogy, then, are grounded in the historical and current particulars of their everyday lives, but importantly, at the same time, oriented toward an imagined but possible future. As an example, on any given day of the month-long program, if you were to drop into the social science or writing classroom, or listen in on the conversations across the range of practices that constitute life in the migrant program, the topics you would hear, the people discussed, the issues raised, would usually be presented in such a way that made clear that they are located in a history. And you would begin to understand how an historicized view of the educational and social political reality of migrant and immigrant communities helps to incite a reframing of education, of the self, and of one's future actions. I turn now to a representative moment to illustrate this point, in which the lead program instructor has just shared with significant passion, emotion, and detail his own autobiography, including a PowerPoint of his family pictures and artifacts to tell his story, as a means to introduce the concept and the purpose of the autobiography, which is the central genre of writing in our program, as well as the notion of author, the student as an historical actor. Raise your hand if you're an historical actor, he asks the students, as he prompts them to think begin to think about how to locate themselves and what details to marshal as they write their autobiographies.
Just because we didn't get to it in the readings doesn't mean that it wasn't a part of the program. So if you have something in class that you were talking about, or in the gender circles, right? Or at feedback, at the tutoring sessions, then bring it in. Bring it in. Use everything that the program is. The curriculum isn't only in your little notebooks. The curriculum is in everything that you felt and experienced and understood in whatever way throughout the program. Okay? Raise your hand if you're a historical actor. A historical actor. Raise your hand. Do you make history? Do you make history? Are you history makers? See, some of you are like, maybe, you know, everybody else raising their hand. I'll raise mine too, you know. I mean, some of you are like, are you sure? No, I'm not going to raise my hand because I don't think I'm